Inside, safe, everybody. Good morning. I hope you had a pleasurable night last night and are ready to go again. And I'm very happy to be the one to introduce Tim Ingold, whose work I have had the pleasure and challenge to dive into, not only because of this introduction today, but because I, in fact, have included works of Tim Ingold in the project I'm working on right now. And I'm sure that a lot of my colleagues, not only here at the University of Denmark, but all over, University of Southern Denmark, but all the universities in Denmark are working with Tim Ingold's works right now. But as I learned when I contacted Tim, he's also a very robust man, so he asked me to keep the introduction short. Nevertheless, I have a bit of a formal introduction also. So Ingold holds a PhD in social anthropology, and after first a lectureship and since a professorship, and also a Max Gluckman professorship in Manchester, he was appointed chair of social anthropology at the University of Aberdeen in 1999 to set up a new department of anthropology at the School of Social Science. And from 2008 to 2011, he was also head of this School of Social Science. He holds, among other things, a fellowship of the British Academy and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and has received the honorary doctorate by, among others, Leuphana University of Lüneburg in Germany. He has published numerous books, chapters, and articles on the perception of the environment and the relation in human life and experience between movement, knowledge, and description. His ongoing research project, Knowing from the Inside, Anthropology, Art, Architecture, and Design, is funded by an advanced grant from the European Research Council and is concerned with the connections between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture, the so-called 4As. Conceived as a way of exploring the relations between human beings and the environments they inhabit. Taking an approach radically different from the conventional anthropologies and archaeologies of art and architecture, Ingold is looking at ways of bringing together the 4As as mutually enhancing ways of engaging with our surroundings. Among Ingold's many publications are The Life of Lines from 2015, Making, Anthropology, Archaeology, Art and Architecture from 2013, and Being Alive, Essays on Movement, Knowledge and Description from 2011, probably the most read in a Danish context. However, in Denmark as elsewhere, as I mentioned, Ingold is read and discussed extensively these years across disciplines as one of the leading figures in terms of the ongoing paradigmatic, both theoretical and methodological shift known under many names, among them the ontological or sensorial, you name it, turn. I'm looking very much forward to listen to the lecture, and so are all of you, I'm sure. So let us give a warm welcome to Professor Tim Ingold.
Thank you very much, and for that extremely generous introduction. Thank you all for coming along on a Saturday morning, and thank you for having me. I'm enjoying myself very much. My title, a little enigmatic, is Life Off Screen. It could have been Life on Surfaces, because I think what I want to argue is the surface of the screen is a kind of anti-surface, and as persons and things are present to us by way of their surfaces, well, so then the screen is also a kind of anti-presence. But I'll get to the screen somewhere near the end. There's a lot to say before that. The last 2 years have seen a remarkable revival of interest in surfaces, in my own discipline of social anthropology, to be sure, but also in geography, architecture and design, in studies of literary, visual and material culture. And that this revival appears to have issued from multiple disciplinary sources more or less spontaneously and at much the same time, suggests that its roots lie in broader intellectual currents across the arts and humanities, which many have identified, albeit in the somewhat arch lexicon to which self-styled theorists are prone, identified with an inversion of the relation between ontology and epistemology, or more prosaically, between the conditions of being in the world and of having some knowledge of it. And this inversion has undone the metaphysical assumption that the true essence of things and persons is to be found deep inside them, in an inner core that can be reached only by breaking open the external appearance behind which it hides. It's this assumption that so often leads us to equate the surface with what is superficial. It's why we distrust surfaces and the meanings they convey, why we think we have to break through them or peel them aside if we are to arrive at real significance. But what if there's nothing underneath? What if surfaces are the real sites for the generation of meaning? Then by mining them, excavating them, or clearing them away, we may in fact be destroying precisely what we seek to find and that lies under our very noses, convinced as we are that the truth can never be on the surface, but somewhere deeper down. But there is a risk that as we surface from the depths, we veer too far the other way, lifting off into stratospheric domains of hyper-abstraction, in which surfaces are not so much broken through as vaporized. So I would like to begin with a plea for humility in our attending to surfaces. We should defer to them. There's so much to see, so much to learn. Theorists, only too keen to inaugurate the latest turn, to announce yet another transformation in human sensibilities, or to tell us yet again how anything one might have thought to stand for itself is always already inextricably and irrevocably implicated, intertwined, or even imbricated with everything else, are inclined to feats of hyperbolic excess that don't so much undermine the surfaces to which they refer as overmine them. One priceless example from a theorist, Patricia Disinetto-Clough, who informs us, for example, that the body and the machine, the virtual and the real, and nature and technology are inextricably implicated, always already interlaced. Well, it's all very well to speak of the entwinement of threads in a textile, or the imbrication of tiles on a roof. In both, surfaces are formed through the iteration of basic operations, as we can observe from watching a weaver at work, or a tiler at work. But the metaphorical extension of these operations to such imponderables as nature, culture, and technology drains them of significance. The point is that the very move that brings us back to surfaces, and indeed to presence, has consequences for the kind of intellectual work we call theory. A theory of surfaces that practices what it preaches must not only raise being up from the depths, but also take knowing down from the heights. It must join with the texture of the world, with its materials and processes, answering to them as they to it. The practice of theory, in short, must be a modality of habitation, a way of thinking and working with stuff on a level with the materials of its trade. So perhaps the place to start is with the mundane surfaces of everyday life, surfaces which do not draw attention to themselves for their spectacular novelty or technical exceptionality or iconic imagery or transgressive audacity, but which have nevertheless forever held human life in their folds. I mean the surfaces of water, mud, stone, tree bark, field and skin, of brick, cloth and paper, of pottery, glass and metal. And by the same token, we could start also with the everyday gestures that orient themselves to surfaces and contrive to treat them. They include washing, scrubbing, brushing, sweeping, raking, shaving, ironing, mowing, polishing, scraping, grinding, and much more. And these are operations that turn rough into smooth, dull into shiny, opaque into transparent, written scrawl into blank slate. And many of them involve utensils that remain unsung, scarcely even warranting an entry in any inventory of material culture. Our technical manuals customarily give pride of place to the point and the cutting edge, things which make an intelligible mark on the world or to craft a form, at the expense of implements more commonly used for preparation, removing blemishes or unwanted growth, covering up mistakes, and cleaning up afterwards. And yet, where would we be without dishcloths and dusters, mops and brooms, irons and rubbers, files and sandpaper? And to that list, we might actually add the painter's or decorator's broad brush, in contrast to the sharpened pencil of the draftsman. And that the painter and decorator works with colour and the draftsman with grayscale suggests that one of the consequences of the turn to surfaces could be to release colour from the discipline of the line and to allow it to literally splash out where once it had been fenced in. Anyway, what all of these implements share in use is a back and forth movement of the hand and arm that is neither precisely measured out nor targeted, that covers a surface without delimiting it, that ever exceeds or overflows its objects, but that nevertheless harbours an intense and intimate feel for the materials of which these objects are formed. And perhaps the best generic verb for this movement in the English language is to wipe, which comes from Proto-Germanic wipjan, which means literally to move back and forth. That's what to wipe means. So I think I just demonstrate this. Well, I have a line here. Well, then, how am I going to get rid of that line? I take a handkerchief and I go like this, up, down, in a movement that does not delimit any area of the surface, but I can feel through my handkerchief that's actually a very smooth blackboard. I can't feel any blemishes on it, but if there were, I would have felt them. So to wipe a surface by hand, whether bare or holding a cloth or brush, is to register every bump or hollow, every crease or fold, not as a feature set upon the surface, as though the surface were but a homogeneous and isotropic stage on which everything of interest is placed, but as a variation intrinsic to the surface itself. And this is a modality of perception, otherwise known as haptics. It's close-up, affective, and kinesthetic. So wiping is a haptic gesture par excellence, but is it limited to the hand? Can I not also wipe the surface with my eyes? Could eyesight be as haptic as manual touch? Laura Mutz, for example, has developed a theory of haptic visuality, a modality of vision that functions in ways similar to touch in evoking experience and memory, and for Mutz, it's specifically through the medium of film. Indubitably, the same prejudices that have biased our accounts of gesture and tool use have also affected theories of perception. Vision, traditionally ascendant in the pantheon of the senses, has long been defined by the point and the cutting edge. Thus we have inherited from Greek antiquity the comparison of the act of looking to the bowman's shooting of an arrow towards its target. So the Greek verb, as you know, skopai, to look, comes from skopos, literally the target of the bowman, the mark to which he gazes as he aims. And also we've inherited from Renaissance theorists of perspective, such as Leon Battista Alberti, the notion of the line of sight as a taut thread that cuts orthogonally through the plane of projection. And Alberti, remember, defined the line as a sign whose length can be divided into parts but so slender that it cannot be split. It's a singular property of vision, according to this view, that it allows us to have the world at a distance, to obtain a knowledge of forms so objectively detached from the visceral conditions of existence as to be unsullied by the vagaries of sensory experience. So vision, understood in this light, sets up an optical relation between mind and world. And this relation, in this relation, both the seer and the seen, that is, both the eye and the object of its attention, are fixed in place, and the line of sight connects the two. Now, of course, this optical relation is no more confined to vision than is the alternative haptic relation confined to touch. So the fundamental distinction between a perceptual space defined on the one hand by unfettered oscillatory movement, as when I'm wiping the board, and on the other by a measured point-to-point connection, is independent of the particular sensory modality involved. For Deleuze and Guattari, this, of course, is the distinction between smooth and striated space, which they associate with haptic and optical perception, respectively. And they explicitly prefer the word haptic to tactile, precisely because, as they say, not only can the eye itself fulfill a non-optical function, but it's not also the only organ to be endowed with an optical capacity. So there can be optical touch as well as haptic vision, and is optical touch nowhere more than in the operation of touch-sensitive electronic devices in which everything depends on the precise point of contact of the fingertip, not at any feeling for the screen. But for us now, the key question is this: how does the switch from an optical to a haptic mode of perception alter the way we think about surfaces? For optical vision, the vectors of projection are rays of light, and the most important thing about surfaces then is how they affect the passage of rays. Are they transmitted or absorbed or reflected or refracted? A perfectly transparent surface, such as a window pane completely free from dirt and impurity, if you imagine such an ideal thing, cannot be seen, but affords the sight of what lies behind. However, the opaque surfaces visible behind this window disclose in their reflective properties the visible forms of objects. And by way of an optical back projection, these forms are cast in appearance, though not in substance, that is, they're cast as images on what we take to be the surface of the mind. And of course, appearances can be deceptive, which is why a psychology of vision that assumes opticality by default is so obsessed with the phenomena of illusion, and why the myth persists that it is possible, at least in principle, for the eye to be so tricked by the realistic painting of a scene that the viewer imagines it as real life. These are, of course, the so-called trompe l'oeil paintings. Remember that in his book, Art and Illusion, Ernst Gombrich recalls the apocryphal story relayed to us by Pliny of the Greek painter Zeuxis, who claimed to be able to paint grapes so deceptively that birds came to peck at them. And challenged by his rival Parrhasios to draw aside the curtains on a painting of his own, Zeuxis himself was caught out, discovering to his dismay that the curtains themselves were part of the painting too. But in real life, of course, we are not deceived even by the most virtuosic of trompe l'oeil paintings. Why? Because every picture is painted on a surface and the world is not. And it's perfectly evident to us that a picture is two things at once. It's a representation of a scene, in the case of this kind of painting, but it's also a panel of material with a certain texture that has been completely covered over with paint. And we see this because the eye, too, enters the surface as well as looking at it. So optical vision, in short, alights on surfaces only to pass directly through them or to bounce directly off them, but not to remain there. To note there that it is nevertheless possible for optical vision to become trapped or distracted by superficial intricacies. The anthropologist Alfred Tell has suggested that in many cultures, complex ornamental patterns inscribed on key surfaces like doors and thresholds of houses have served a kind of protective function as what he calls demonic flypaper, apotropeically luring to the surface a gaze laced with evil intent and preventing it from passing through to potential victims on the other side. Rather similar arguments are used even today about overly ornate handwriting, which so captures the reader's attention as to glue it to the surface of the page so that it can't penetrate through to the meanings that lie behind it. Many theorists have written that the more visible the writing, the less legible it is. That's by the way. Surfaces in this optical perspective are important not in themselves, but for what they potentially open up and for what they disclose. But they're also important for what they hide and for the deceit that they can practice on us. In their transparency, they specify nothing, but give us access to a world of objects. In their opacity, they specify the outward forms of these objects, while yet closing off access to their interiority. But haptic vision abides with surfaces and dwells in them. Its interest is less in the conformation of surfaces than in their texture. And this texture tells us not of the form of things, but of their substantive composition. So any ordinary surface is revealed in subtle variations of pigment and illumination, and especially of light and shade. Introducing his ecological approach to visual perception, the psychologist James Gibson lists among what he calls the ecological laws of surfaces that any surface has a characteristic texture depending on the composition of its substances. Moreover, we can recognize the texture and know of what it is composed only because the surface is neither completely homogeneous nor completely amorphous. So the typical surface, Gibson says, is both speckled and rough. Observe the surface of your hand, or of a cloth, or of a puddle in the rain, or a patch of gravel, or a grass lawn, and every fold of the skin, every stitch of the cloth, every ripple of water, particle of grit, or blade of grass is picked out in the contrast between the relative illumination of its light-facing convexities and the relative darkness of the concavities in their shade. So a crease, or what we perceive as a crease, is the shadow of a fold. What we perceive as a hollow is the shadow of a bump. But since the fold and the crease, or the bump and the hollow, are of the surface rather than on it, the surface in its dappled texture is self-shadowed. The art historian Michael Baxendale has made this point precisely in his book on Shadows and Enlightenment. In an ordinary illuminated environment, he writes, one is aware of being in an indescribably intricate ambience of micro-shadow. It may usually be called texture, a word that somehow invokes the sense of touch, but it consists visually of almost pure shadow, very small self-shadows, derived shadows, and slant tilt shadings. And these shadowy variations are ever-changing, and a haptic vision follows and answers to them. Think, for example, of the waves of the sea, or the rippling waters of a stream, or a wheat field swept by the wind. A haptic vision seeks not to freeze the surface corrugations in some momentary form, so that they might be modelled in the mind through a one-to-one mapping of data points on the surface and in the model. It's rather to join with the currents and with the wind. It's to feel the waves, the ripples, and the swish of the field as movements. There's a sense in which optical vision always arrives after the fact, as in a game of grandmother's footsteps. On the very instant that you turn to face the world, to take it in at a glance, the movement stops. But haptic vision is always along in the continual birth of things, alert to the movements going on behind your back, or more likely, on the periphery of the visual field. As is well known, and as Johanni Pallasmaa reminded us yesterday, peripheral vision is more sensitive to movements than to forms, foveal vision vice versa. And the face is surely the most fundamental way in which consider the human face. The face is surely the most fundamental way in which we are present to others, as Levinas argued. But only in the most artificial situations do we fix the face of a fellow human being in an unblinking and immobile stare. One of those situations is in passport control, where the aim is to identify the face of the traveller with the face in the photograph. Another is in the bizarre, indeed I'd say ludicrous, experiments of psychologists, in which subjects are asked to rank facial snapshots, usually of women, in order of preference, with a view to the discovery of innate and evolved biases in the perception of facial beauty. Huge sums of money are spent on these experiments. This is not, of course, how we see the faces of others in everyday life. We rather see them alive with movement, in continually changing variations of complexion. Thinking about it, I think complexion is as good a word as texture, if not even a better one, to epitomize the constitutive quality of any surface to which a haptic vision attends. Though the origins of the word complexion lie in medieval physiology and the combination of humours that were supposed to determine the temperament of a being, human or otherwise, the word remains in common use today, with primary reference to the skin and above all to the face, in a way that reveals the sheer impossibility in practice of separating expression from affect in the encounter with another living being. In complexion, the lines and wrinkles of the face and its palette of shades from pallid to ruddy are so completely blended with health and mood, and even with the atmospherics of weather, that they cannot be disentangled. And it's of course no accident that many of our weather words, as well as our words for human moods, are derived from the Latin verb temperare, meaning to mix. They include words like temper, temperament, temperate, and temperature. But this has a really important corollary. It means that in its complexion, the face does not belong to the head, nor does the skin belong to the body. Or more generally, the surface, as it emerges within a field of haptic perception, is nothing like the surface of an object, or body, or head, as it might be revealed to optical examination. With the object, the surface is simply the outer envelope of a form, separating what is inside from what is outside. And indeed, it's thanks to the surface that we can regard the form as a coherent and self-contained entity that can be distinguished from its surroundings, that is, as an object. But as we've seen, the surface allows the form to be inspected from the outside while concealing its interior content. It's the guarantor that inside and outside keep to their respective domains and don't mix. Brandon Hookway, in his recent study of the interface, puts it like this. On the one hand, the surface is the means by which a thing expresses itself and the means by which it may be read, while on the other hand, the surface is that which must be penetrated or seen through in order to uncover the essential properties or traits of the thing which may be hidden or remain unexpressed in the formulation of what is expressed. So that's a particular sense of the interface of an object with an inside and an outside, which I'll come back to. So in that sense, no surface, no object. But with complexion, it's just the opposite. Because here, interior and exterior are not set apart by the surface. The surface neither encloses a cavity nor discloses a volume. Rather, the surface emerges in the very fusion of an affectivity that intensifies from within, and the weathering, including such atmospheric effects as sunshine, wind, and rain, that brings its influence to bear from without. So the surface produced in this commingling of forces and movements, constitutively from the inside out and erosively from the outside in, is itself of both inestimable depth and limitless in the extent of its outpouring into the surroundings. And this is what the architectural design theorist Lars Squaybrook calls a deep surface. Such a surface, he says, instead of exposing its interior, charges the surrounding space by adding an atmosphere that immediately draws everything in. So as in a landscape of glistening rocks and dark pools, in its variations of light and shade, the recesses of the earth meet and mingle with the brilliance of the sky. Or in the idiom of Deleuze and Guattari, surface complexion, whether of space or landscape, and there are many parallels between them, surface complexion is generated in the interplay of the black holes of affectivity and the white walls of expressive significance, of shadow and illumination. And this holy surface, at once profound and animated, weighty and buoyant, is not so much superficial as interstitial. The great Victorian social thinker and art critic John Ruskin was getting at much the same thing when, introducing the fifth and final volume of his Modern Painters, published in 1860, he described the surface of the earth as a veil of strange intermediate being. Deep down, Ruskin argued, the earth is dead and cold, but at its surface, in the textures of its meadows and forests, rocky outcrops, moor and heath, it ministers to its inhabitants through this veil, which, and I quote, which breathes but has no voice, moves but cannot leave its appointed place, passes through life without consciousness. So perhaps then we should follow Ruskin in thinking of the surface of haptic perception as a veil. Ruskin himself began with the injunction to dress it and keep it. And dressing here is an act of care, not of looking at, but of looking after. The veil covers, but does not cover up. It dresses, but it does not dress up. It's not a disguise, but a revelation. Encrusted with its own material, the veil is not just a self-shadowing, but also a self-adornment. So far from hiding the depths behind the surface, it allows us to feel the depths in the surface. See, why else do we use the word, and this might be specific to English, but I apologize for that, but why else do we use the verb to wear to mean in the same breath both adornment and erosion? The worn face, wrinkled and ruddied by long exposure to sun and wind, wears its expression. Worn hands wear the folds and calluses that come from years of working with materials. Ancient stone steps wear the patina of thousands of passing feet. Worn ground wears the texture of its wearing away. And with that, we can at last return to the gestures and implements of wiping with which I began. I observed that in their polishing, grinding, brushing, and so on, these are operations that smooth the surface, that remove its striations, erase its inscriptions. They are operations that bring one surface into contact with another. They are interfacial, not in the sense of crossing a threshold between the exterior and interior of an object or a body, but in the sense of establishing a relation between faces, and not always a sympathetic one. What child has not been reprimanded with the words, "Wipe that expression off your face"? Or who has not felt the blush of embarrassment? And yet neither cheek nor blush is visible, save in the face of another whose expression answers to it. Is it not then precisely in such relations of interfaciality that social life is lived? If that's so, then the turn to surfaces is nothing less than a restoration, that is, the restoration of social life itself. So in order to commence this restoration, I'd like to begin with an anthropological story which concerns, anthropological in the sense that it's reported by an anthropologist, Peter Dow, from fieldwork, in Peru, and it concerns one gentleman called Sangama, a man of the Piro people, native to the Peruvian Amazon, and a reputed shaman. Though formerly illiterate, Sangama had observed that his white masters, that is Spanish landowners and colonial officials, would spend long hours reading their newspapers. They appeared absorbed in these complex patterns of black marks arrayed on a white background. But Sangama, too, claimed that he could read the newspaper. But what he saw in the sheet were not messages encoded in the marks printed on it. Rather, he said he saw a face. It was the face and lips of a beautiful woman, and she was speaking to him. And he, Sangama, was lip reading. Now, in terms of Piro cosmology, this makes perfect sense, because Piro supposed that their bodies are suffused with vibrating patterns that come to them with the shimmering light and are transformed at the surface of the skin into sound. And Piro bodies and artifacts, just the Piro but other neighboring people in that region, are covered all over with these radiant patterns through which they speak and sing. So it's no wonder, really, that Sangama interpreted the patterns of newsprint in the same way. He was reading the woman's face. The face is indeed a mystery. We remember that except in a culture such as ours, which has surrounded itself with mirrors, the face is one part of the body, not the only part, but one part of the body that its owner cannot normally see. Rather, where the face is, we see the world. And I can tap on my forehead and say, yes, I've got a face there, it seems to be hard, but actually what I'm tapping up, saying, what's this finger doing here? Because it's coming in the middle of a visual field where on top of my shoulders is all of you, of the world. So where the face is, we see the world, including other persons who may or may not be looking at us. So, as I hinted a moment ago, is the face really part of the body at all? Or more specifically, is it part of the head, which is the seat of the brain, eyes, ears, and the organs of speech? And as I already mentioned, for Deleuze and Guattari, they're quite clear that the face is not part of the head. The body, including the head, is constituted anatomically within what they call the volume cavity system. It has an inside and an outside, and it's bounded by the skin. But the face is not included in the body, nor is it confined to the head, because the face is a surface, facial traits, lines, wrinkles, and is produced by, I mentioned it earlier, what Deleuze and Guattari called the white wall black hole system. And black and white here are not the poles of an absolute dichotomy. They rather denote the way in which the face emerges from the play of affect and meaning. So a face that speaks and sings, smiles and frowns, that wears its expressions on its surface, must needs have a surface on which to express them. And for these expressions to well up from the depths of feeling, sunk into the surfaces must be orifices from which these affectations spring. So in the idiom of Deleuze and Guattari, the surface is the white wall, the orifices are the black holes, and together they furnish the conditions of emergence for what we perceive as a face, with its luminous surfaces and shadowy orifices. And that precisely was what Sangama saw in the paper he was reading, a surface with holes, from which there appeared a lively face reading his. But it's not what modern readers see, accustomed as they are to the conventions of print media. The principle of projection that lies at the very genesis of modernity, as Michel Serres has noted, has pulled the black hole, rather like the inverted finger of a glove, into an apical point where the eye opens to the mind of the conscious subject, while the white wall has receded to a plane on which the subject projects its meanings. So the whole now is like the lens of a projector, the wall like a cinematic screen, indifferent to the images that play upon its surface. Modern subjects, peering through the eye as through a lens, see no other face than their own. It's their peculiar predicament that they can see without being seen, read without being read, save by themselves. And historically, though, this predicament is the exception and not the rule. I mean, looking at the entire early history of human faciality, Peter Sloterdijk has argued, one can say that humans have faces not for themselves, but for the others. And throughout this history, what each face offered the other was not so much a reflection or reproduction as what Sloterdijk calls an affective echo. So faces did not exist independently, as though each adhered to its own body as a unique index of personal identity, but were necessarily constituted in relations of interfaciality and therefore presupposed at the very least a bipolar configuration like an ellipse with two focal points. It was the ubiquitous mirror, Sloterdijk argues, that eventually cut the ellipse in two, setting up a pseudo-interfacial relation with another that is not another, your reflection in the mirror. So the face before the mirror, he continues, can relish the illusion of being in a closed field of vision as it has expelled the others from its inner space and replaced them with the technical means of self-completion, that is, the media in their modern function. So is this then the function of the printed page? Is it to furnish the reader with such means of self-completion? When we look at the surface of the page, are we, like Sangama, observing the face of another, both beaming at and speaking to us? Or are we, like Sloterdijk's modern individual, gazing into the mirror, seeing in it the reflection of our own soul? Could it be because of the pages having taken on a mirror function in a system of projection that reading has become the solitary, silent, and self-absorbed activity that it is today? And finally, could an interfaciality in which each renders to the other not a reflection, but an affective echo, give us a better model for human social life itself? Well, these are large questions, and I'm not yet sure how to answer them. What I am sure is that they require us to think of the interface in a quite different way from that to which we are accustomed. Classically, in the field of design, the interface is understood as a face between inside and outside. And as such, it is one component of a triad that defines the closed form of an object. The other components of the triad are surface and infrastructure. So the surface, characteristically smooth and opaque, divides the exterior from the interior, or from the perspective of a user of the object, the near side from the far side. And the infrastructure comprises the inner workings of the object that lend it its functionality. And people always use the example of the mobile phone. This is very primitive Nokia, but here's the object, and there's this side, there's the other side which I can't see. Inside is the infrastructure, here's the surface, and the interface are the buttons that enable me to somehow transfer my input from one side to the other. So then the interface in this view is made up of one or several interruptions or perforations in the surface that afford some sort of exchange between exterior and interior, allowing the user to activate the infrastructure when I press a key on my phone. So they come in the familiar form of buttons and keys, switches and knobs, all of which puncture the surface. And the configuration of interfaces, for this reason, has always been a dilemma for designers. If you have too few knobs and things, the user's ability to control the object is compromised. If you have too many holes, the integrity of the object itself is placed in jeopardy. For it would end up, in the words of the eccentric design philosopher Wilhelm Flusser, with as many holes as a Swiss cheese. Now, at first glance, there's a striking parallel between this view of the object surface riddled with holes and what Deleuze and Guattari have to say about the surface of the face. Remember, they too say that the face is a holy surface. Holy here, H-O-L-E-Y. But in truth, these are surfaces of entirely different kinds. Because like the body with its head, including apertures that also mediate material and sensory exchange between exterior and interior, ear holes, mouth, and so on, the object is constituted by the volume cavity system. But the face, as we've seen, is produced by the white wall black hole system. And in terms of this latter system, the interface is not a face between, but a between faces. It's a bit confusing, but I'm simply drawing it. But the face between is, if I would do a vertical section, and so this is the face between, and if this is the surface of my phone and I press a button, this mediates a transition of some kind. The between faces is this. And something's going on between those two. So this is the face between A and B. This is the between faces. Sorry, it's slightly confusing nomenclature, but you get the point, I hope. So where the face between is single, that has two sides, a near side and a far side, the between faces is double, but its twin surfaces have no far side. An example of the first kind of the face between, which I've already spoken about, is the window pane. A slightly less obvious example of the between faces is the meeting of surfaces under the printing press, going down, or subsequently in the surface-to-surface contact of pages in a printed book. And this example is less obvious since ostensibly a page in a book is just as two-sided as a window pane. You can look over and say, well, it's this page and it's that page. And it looks like the diagram there on the right. But it would be more correct to say of the page, printed front and back, that it has a reverse than that it has a far side. Because, like the two visages of the mythical Janus, god of transitions, back and front face in opposite directions. Nothing passes through. So to turn the page of a book is not to cross a face between, but to transition from one between faces to another. Right? So that if this is the page of the book, if you've got several pages like this, and this is a cross section of the substance of the page. Well, when you turn the page, you're going from here to there. You're crossing over from one between faces to another. You don't go through the page. So the page has a reverse side, it doesn't have a far side. So let's, just to get this clear, let's compare a printed book with a jewellery box. With its surface dividing inside from outside, with its surface divided inside and outside, its shiny contents and the lid serving as an interface, the box is clearly constituted within the volume cavity system. And perhaps a book, with its front and back covers and spine, could also be considered partially boxed. So raising the front cover somehow lifts the lid on the book. But when it comes to turning the pages, the book no longer figures as a cavity with volume, accessed by way of a face between, but a volume in itself, comprising an assemblage of between faces. And ever since the birth of print, the materiality of the page, with its two faces pointing in contrary ways, each in surface-to-surface contact with the page preceding or following, has come increasingly into contradiction with a mode of perception that cuts directly through as vision cuts through a pane. It's a contradiction between these two modes of interfaciality, respectively between faces and face between. And only in recent decades has the contradiction been resolved decisively in favour of the latter, in favour of the face between, through the development of digital devices with plasma screens. Because on screen, there are no more pages to open or to turn, only windows to look through. And with this we come to the story of the screen. I'm finished with this story, and of how it has evolved to be the opposite in every respect of what it was originally. Once upon a time, the screen was a woven fabric. Writing in the middle of the 19th century in a treatise on the origins and evolution of architecture, Gottfried Semper argued that the first walls were screens, plaited from sticks and branches. There were fences designed to keep animals out and pens to keep them in. And from there it was but a small step to the weaving of textiles, to pattern generation and thence to the making of carpets. Now, nowadays, we're inclined to think of walls as made from such solid materials as brick or stone, and of wall builders as masons or bricklayers, but Semper concluded quite to the contrary, that the first wall fitters, Wandbereiter, were weavers of mats and carpets, noting in his support that the German word for wall, Wand, shares the same root as the word for dress or clothing, Gewand. But Semper was also careful to distinguish the light, screen-like enclosure, denoted by Wand, from the massiveness of the solid, protective earthwork, for which German has the word Mauer. Writing in much the same vein a century later, Wilhelm Flasser, who I mentioned a moment ago, also distinguishes between two kinds of wall, corresponding to Wand and Mauer. They are the screen wall, he calls it, of woven fabric, and the solid wall hewn from rock or built up from heavy components. So throughout the towns and villages of Europe, Middle East and North Africa, houses were traditionally made of solid walls, but screen walls were the specialty of tent-dwelling nomadic pastoralists. Now the wall of a tent, like the sail of a ship or the wing of a glider, has first and foremost to contend with the wind. So Flasser compares the tent to a nest in a tree, a place of rest in a turbulent medium where people and the experiences they bring with them gather, interweave, and disperse in a way that precisely parallels the treatment of the fibres in fabricating the material from which the tent's screen walls would have been made. Indeed, the very word screen suggests to Flasser, quote, a piece of cloth that is open to experiences, open to the wind, open to the spirit, and that stores this experience. He could equally well have been speaking of the written or woven text. The screen could be a veil, a wand, which, like Gewand, dresses a surface without dressing it up. Indeed, Ruskin's earth veil, which I mentioned earlier on, Semper's wand, and Flasser's screen wall are all of a kind with the handwritten scribal text. For the text, as a medieval text, is also a surface that assembles, processes, and disseminates experience in the very weave of its lines. Yet, I have written these lines that I'm reading out to you here. Apologies for reading them out, but I've written these lines on a laptop computer, to my regret and by force of circumstances, knowing that I would much rather be putting pen to paper, staring at what everybody tells me is a screen. And it seems to have absolutely nothing in common with the textual surface. Indeed, so great are the differences that it might better be called an anti-screen. So consider these differences. First, the surface of the screen is heterogeneous. On it, writing emerges as a continual differentiation within its veiled texture. But with the anti-screen, like the one on my laptop, the surface is perfectly homogeneous. It has no texture. It is wholly indifferent to the fragmentary letter forms that play on it, forms that seem to dance before my eyes. These forms are set off against a white background, but the background is not the same as the surface, but lies somewhere behind it and shines through. So instead of a complex pattern of light and shade, the anti-screen sets up an invariant opposition of transparency and opacity. Second, the lines of the screen are woven with an ongoing attention that is close-up, kinetic, and haptic, infused with movement and feeling. This is an attention that goes along. The anti-screen, by contrast, demands an attention that cuts through the surface, stopping movement and feeling in their tracks. This attention is optical, not haptic, and rests on a principle not of gathering, but of projection. And finally, if the epitome of the screen is the fabric, the epitome of the anti-screen is the mirror. So writing on the laptop, nothing but my own words come back at me. There is no other. So what we have in the anti-screen is something akin to the perspectival plane of optical projection, a perfectly transparent window that opens to a white wall upon which the isolated and cogitating subject casts its thought. Indeed, the operating system I use, along with millions like me, is known as Windows, and is branded with a design showing projected beams of light streaming through 4 rectangular panes of glass. So Clearly, the manufacturers of the system are thinking along the same lines. They want us to compare the computer's anti-screen to a window pane, and it's not hard to do so. And for them, moreover, it is an interface in the classical sense, coming between me and the hidden workings of the machine. So with the apparent triumph of the anti-screen over the printed page, the material conditions for the production of the written word seem to have been cleared of any remaining vestiges of feeling. And the fate of the book in this clearance surely gives a foretaste of what might become of our own social lives, which up to now have been lived, for the most part, like the book's pages, that is, between faces. What would social life be like in a world of face-betweens, a world in which every other is a projection of the self? Now, some would say that that is indeed the modern predicament. And of course, where modernity goes, technology follows, bent on converting its imagined world into an experienced reality. But I conclude with the question, is this the world we really want? Thank you very much.
Well, we started a bit late, so I think we can take 5 minutes from the coffee break to comment on question. The lecture we have just heard. Yeah. I see if I can get this to work. No, it was back here, but I don't think it's. Oh, yeah. Hello? Oh, it was. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I think I'm not the only one who thought this was marvelous in its precision and how you managed, in spite of the precision, to make it, to give it a profile. It's really fantastic. Plus, I want to say, and that's how I want to engage. It's been the best description I've ever heard of what I consider an unfortunate daily condition. I mean, namely, being engaged in electronic communication or via electronic media, via screen all the time. I would like to try and connect what you've been saying to what I tried yesterday to see whether we find some common screen, but rather not screen, common page. In the first place, and that's a question, but a question in the sense, I was reminded, especially at the beginning of your description, when you described the page. Is that okay? Yeah. I think so too, yeah. I mean, it has to do with what we're talking about. When you described the page, I thought, I was tempted to think, I mean, you didn't use that word to my knowledge, but it has a metabolic structure. Not that, I mean, you are, so I'm not saying the page and then you're in a metabolic relation to the world, but it is the structure which would make a metabolism with the world possible. Yeah? I mean, a metabolism with you when you would, I mean, give an example. So when my older daughter, we got separated, I mean, by divorce of the parents when she was 3 years old. And for 14 years, I was sending her postcards, one postcard every day. And I knew that her mom would read the postcards to her, and she couldn't read, and yet I had the feeling that by a postcard, I mean, with that surface that had something inscribed by me, there was a relationship that was potentially metabolic, right? I mean, not that I had to feed her, but that's what I mean by metabolic. So that's the first question. I mean, and secondly, and I think I'd never gone so far thinking about it, but the second question would be, even if you have an email exchange, for example, or you read a manuscript, a dissertation manuscript, a manuscript of a colleague on the screen, and you know that's her text, or his text, or that's my wife's message, but my temptation is to go so far as to say, even that turns into my own text. Yeah? I mean, I cannot, via screen, I cannot hold on to a type of otherness and that type of positive resistance in others. And thirdly then, I mean, that was where I felt a potential closeness between your marvelous description and what I've been trying yesterday in a much more sloppy way. But could you associate that feeling I tried to describe as this urge to hold on to something and this lack to hold on to something? I thought, I mean, if I have argued in a very abstract way, but you really describe beautifully a microscopic and yet omnipresent structure of that lack. Yeah? I mean, that precisely if there's more and more communication, that is communication by a screen, to a degree that even communication that's face-to-face turns into a screen-like form of communication, that is a very basic contribution to that feeling that you cannot hold on to something, as opposed to writing postcards, as opposed to you taking notes on a sheet of paper, and once again, many, many things.
Thank you for the generous comments, and I agree with what you say. I don't think there's any difference. And so taking up the 3 points, yes, I think the page, or if we want to go back, say, to medieval vellum or parchment, that is absolutely metabolic. I mean, there can be absolutely no doubt that page is part of a whole system of metabolism. And when you think particularly, and it's fun with parchment because you can trace the history of the manufacture of the parchment itself, which started life on the back of an animal, and then had to go through all sorts of phases of treatment before it was scratched upon by the scribe. So it's inside a whole system of metabolic relations that even includes the animal and so on. And then you might think, well, with the development of the manufacture of paper, you've got trees, and there's still all sorts of things involved. And what I really would like to do, I didn't really do in this paper, but I've tried to do elsewhere, is to really start thinking about how the substance of paper itself, the ink, the colour, or lack of colour of the ink, all these things really do contribute in quite fundamental ways to meaning. And I only understood that after I realised I've been sort of comparing handwriting and print, rather favourably to handwriting, unfavourably to print, until I started talking to printers and started realising just what a wonderful, complicated craft it is, and how the thing about print is it's actually a between faces operation, because you're bringing two surfaces into contact. Inside there, something is going on which you can only see when you open it up, and that's the revelation of the text. And so there's all that, it all goes once you move to the electronic medium. No printing, no paper, and so on. On the second point, I also agree with you that even if you're I'm reading an email from my wife. Yeah, okay, it often happens, and you're in a sense having to battle against it. You feel the tension between your intimate familiarity with the person who's written those lines and the utter impersonality of what is in front of you, and you experience it. I experience it as a very fundamental sort of existential tension, which of course you don't experience if you got an old-fashioned handwritten letter in an envelope, because you can feel there she was holding the pen, and that's her handwriting, and so on. And then on the final point of holding on to things, yes, again, there's a way in which in older reading practices, you really could almost physically hold on to words. And that there's a sense, again, at least I have this sense, working on screen, that the words are they're always sliding off. There's a kind of, it's almost like it's a slippery sort of surface in which the words are always at risk of disintegration when you look at them too much. I have that feeling, and I find it, after a while, you start feeling giddy if you stare at text too long on a screen. So I get absolutely incensed by our university administrators who insist on getting rid, but even more, librarians now don't like books anymore, nor the publishers. They all want to go. That's a devastating attack on scholarship.
We have very many questions now. I think we take two in a row, and then I'm very sorry to have to stop you, because then we will be too late. But I remind you that we have a panel again, and there will be one more chance to ask Tim there. So, would you, and Kirsten, do, and then we...
Well, first of all, I think it's a wonderful idea to use surface as a research project. That's really brilliant, I think. But I was wondering whether you could extend this theory and this thoughts to beyond just materiality. And I was reminded by the talk about one of the famous remarks of Freud. Freud, in the way, by the way, made a kind of conversion. First, he was a kind of digger into the deep. He wanted to go deep inside the human psyche. And then, in the beginning of the 20th century, he made a kind of conversion. And it is very well summarized by his idea his insistence to on the overflächig zu bleiben, to stay on the surface. That's what he tried to do in the rest of his career. And the phenomenon of transference, for example, is a complete operationalization of his insistence to stay on the surface. So I was wondering whether you could extend your line of thinking beyond materiality and to try to see whether it can also be used in how surfaces on the overflächig zu bleiben works between humans in psychological.
This is a very important but also a very big question. Do you think you maybe could start the panel answering it? or trying to elaborate on it? And then we take one question more and then we start the panel. Would that be okay with expanding on?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'm sorry for...
then I have a moment to think about it.
Yeah.
Kirsten, the mic, please.
Yes.
Sorry, Kirsten Brodmer. Thanks again for fantastically illuminating.
There are some problems with this.
There's
Can you
some
try out?
Sorry,
I can hear. Yeah.
I'll speak up. It was a wonderful, thought-provoking, absolutely fantastic presentation. I wonder if you could maybe also for the panel think about if you scale down your analytical perspective to what you started with, would be one of my questions, to the materiality. And you talked about swiping, which I thought was really illuminating. If you think about the modern way of technologies, it's very much about swiping. It's not about touching buttons anymore. And would that put a question to your binaries there? That's one of my... So if you scale down to the materiality, I mean, there's a certain materiality also in the smooth surface that you operate. So scaling down your analytical perspective, would that question that binary? And on the other hand, if you scale up and think about modern communications, they're not about the man or human machine interaction in terms of text. They're very much a question of human visual communication. So in a sense, transcending, you tend to forget about this. So think about FaceTime. You tend to forget about the surface between you. I mean, if you communicate with your wife through FaceTime rather than email, would you get a different sense of that sort of interface? So I'm just thinking about, playing the devil's advocate. If modern technologies, if you think about that in an analytical perspective that involves contextual relations and social life and processual relations, would there be some other kind of binaries that we could talk about?
It's a really good question, and the answer is I honestly don't know. I mean, that I've spoken to people. I'm not a technological person myself. I've spoken to people who have put the argument that you have put and said that with the technologies we're using now, there's all kinds of wiping and swiping and movement and the rest of it, and therefore, my picture is already out of date, and they're saying that there's a technological possibility to move towards a more haptic relation with the world, more feelingful relation with the world, or maybe we're there already. And I don't know, and I think it's a question that could only be asked through research. I mean, I think one would actually have to do some sort of research, some kind of empirical inquiry to find out whether this is. So that makes it a good question. It's one that could actually be studied and probably is being studied. But it would. I think that there has been a quite a radical shift in technological thinking, which is probably a good thing, to the old view in which in an old computer all the workings are inside this box, to one where people are beginning to think that actually surfaces is where it's all happening. So smart textiles is one example of that, where the textile itself is woven from conducting threads which have electronic properties. Or for example, you could design, I think it has been designed, a fountain pen, where you write by hand on paper, but the pen is electronically enhanced so that you get much more feeling through it. But the fact of the matter is that initially design was not oriented in that sort of direction, but it has shifted, and I think that's probably a positive shift. So I don't want to appear to be sort of Heideggerian anti-technology on all fronts, personally, but I think that the forces that are lined up against that sort of thing are not technological forces, they're commercial and corporate ones.
Okay. Let us pause here, and I can't resist telling you that I was with a caretaker for the very small children, and she told that when they are reading books to these infants, they take the book and try to swipe. Yeah, so you tell me that I shall tell.
Yeah, actually session was about to start now, but we will have 10 minutes for coffee, should we say that? So, yeah, 10